Welcome to the June edition of the Economic Club of Traverse City. We're glad you're here. I'm Kathleen Guy, your president. Today, we're looking forward to remarks from Suneel Gupta, entrepreneur, author, a member of the Harvard faculty. His book is available at Horizon Books in downtown Traverse City. Just a note, next month, we'll look forward to returning to in-person meetings on July 22nd. That's a Thursday, so mark your calendars, when our speaker will be local entrepreneur Paul Britton from Britton Banners. In August, we'll welcome entrepreneur Chris McGinnis from Crystal Mountain Resort. In the meantime, we're grateful for this Zoom technology one more time and the ability to bring Suneel Gupta to you today. During our session today, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions by using either the chat button at the bottom of your screen or the Q&A button. As questions occur to you anytime during the presentation, feel free to enter them in, and I will be monitoring questions as they come in, and we can present them to our speaker when he finishes his remarks. Now, a few words about today's speaker. He had a great business idea, but was unable to find investors. His startup idea was Rise, a telehealth service that matched you with a professional nutritionist over your mobile phone. After hundreds of pitches that failed to gain traction and twice being nominated to speak at FailCon, which stands for Failure Conference, Suneel Gupta found himself standing stage left to speak at that conference. Hoping the audience would be packed with potential investors, he didn't notice the New York Times reporter sitting in the audience taking notes. Shortly thereafter, his wife brought him that day's New York Times, open to a full-page article about failure with his face pictured at the top. The piece went viral. He decided to take his new identity and leverage it as a door opener to gain entry to ask for advice with hundreds of fascinating people, from founders of unicorn startups to producers of Oscar-winning films, executives at iconic companies like Pixar and Lego, and even military leaders at the Pentagon. The result? He came upon a life-altering discovery. People who change the world aren't just brilliant, they're backable. A native of Novi, Michigan, Suneel Gupta is on the faculty at Harvard, where he teaches students how to become backable. And he went from being the face of failure for the New York Times to being the new face of innovation for the New York Stock Exchange. His ideas have been backed by firms like Greylock and Google Ventures, and he has invested in startups including Airbnb and SpaceX. He also serves as an emissary for gross national happiness between the US and the Kingdom of Bhutan. Today, he's with us to share the keys to success outlined in his new book, Backable, the surprising truth behind what makes people take a chance on you. I have found it fascinating so far, as noted by my little sticky notes. He draws lessons from hundreds of the world's largest thinkers, biggest thinkers, and who have discovered how to pitch new ideas in a way that has raised millions, influenced large-scale change inside big corporations, and Mr. Gupta has even convinced his 8-year-old daughter to clean her room. Whether you plan to launch a startup or just want to gain the ability to persuade people to take a chance on your potential, lean in and listen today. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Economic Club of Traverse City to welcome Suneel Gupta.
Kathleen, thank you so much. What a wonderful, wonderful introduction. I really, really appreciate it. And I always love seeing a book that's earmarked and has all those notes like that. That makes me very, very happy. So thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And also so cool that I'm your last virtual speaker. And I can't wait to one day kind of visit the club and do this in person.
Would love
Um,
to have you.
I can't wait for that. So, Kathleen, you did a nice job, I think, laying out sort of what this book is really about. But, it's interesting because the word backable is a word that sometimes you might hear in the world of entrepreneurship. Sometimes you hear it in the world of venture capital, but it's still not a word that we actually have in the dictionary right now. So in some ways, it's a little bit new. And the thing about being backable is that it's not just for entrepreneurs. It's not just for founders. It really is for all of us. No matter what type of change we are trying to create in the world, whatever type of idea we have, we know that we can't do it alone. That's true with our career. That's true with our community. That's true with the companies that we work inside. We always need colleagues. We need clients. We need customers. We need friends and family even sometimes to take a chance on something that we have inside our own heads. We need to get them excited about it if it's ever going to come into reality. And that's really fundamentally what this book is all about. There is a difference between creativity and persuasion, right? And yet at the same time, sometimes in our society, we tend to sort of combine those two things. We sort of assume that if an idea isn't explained well, then it must not actually be a good idea. On the other hand, sometimes we assume that something is a great idea simply because it's explained well, when in reality, it's actually not something that we as a company or an organization or as a society should actually go and do. One of my favorite sort of stories from the book, it can be a little bit of a sad one, but I'll share it with you. And it gets to why I decided to write Backable. Bob Ebeling, who was an engineer on the NASA team that sent the Space Shuttle Challenger up into space in the 1980s. And, Bob Ebeling, engineer, sort of had more of an engineer type personality, a little bit more quiet, a little bit more shy, very analytical. And a couple of days before the Space Shuttle Challenger was launched, he was looking at his data and he realized that something was off. He looked at sort of the way the temperature was going to read that day, and he realized that there was going to be something that was going to happen that was not going to end well. And so he did something that I think a lot of us would probably do in his situation. He decided to call a meeting. He got all of his colleagues into a room and he shared his data. And he made a recommendation. And the recommendation was, I think we should delay the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. But after that presentation, his colleagues said, you know what? We've heard what you have to say, but we disagree. And we're going to continue to move forward. And the Space Shuttle Challenger launches. Within 90 seconds, it disintegrates and it kills every astronaut on board. Now, the thing about that is that Bob Ebeling was quick to blame himself for what happened. In fact, he gave an interview with NPR years later where he said, God chose the wrong person for that job. He should have chosen somebody who could have been more persuasive inside the room. Those were his words. And the thing about it, though, is that this type of situation happens all of the time. Again, there's a difference between having a great idea or having the right recommendation and having the persuasive ability to get people rallied around that. You might have the best idea in the world and it can still be dismissed, as it did for Bob Ebeling. But on the flip side of the same coin, we see the same thing happen where people have ideas that are half-baked when they don't necessarily have something that's going to be a tremendous benefit. And they still end up getting people rallied around that. One of the most sort of popular watched documentaries during the pandemic was about the Fire Festival. And if you haven't seen this documentary, it's probably worth checking out. You can watch it on Netflix or Hulu. But the Fire Festival was a gathering on an island in the Caribbean. And a guy named Billy McFarland, who was in his 20s, decided that he wanted to go create a festival. And, he didn't have any entrepreneurial track record. He had no evidence of having done this before, but he was somehow able to convince investors to back him. Now, when people showed up to this festival, they expected to find, white sand beaches, top shelf accommodations, all the things that Billy McFarland had promised. Instead, when they showed up, they found tents There was no drinking water, there was no food, and people were stranded on the island. And there was not a single band that Billy McFarland had said that he was going to book that actually showed up. The entire thing turned out to be a fraud. Billy McFarland today is in prison serving a 6-year sentence for fraud. And yet a lot of people are scratching their heads, including me, wondering like, how did an entrepreneur with zero track record convince highly reputable investors to bet $26 million of funding on him? How did that happen? So in some cases, you have stories like the story of Bob Ebeling. On the other hand, you have stories like Billy McFarland's. We've heard situations about WeWork. We've heard stories about Theranos that sort of continue to pile onto this other side of the coin. And a large part of the reason that I wrote this book is because I think that we need more high integrity people in the world who know how to sell a good idea. We certainly have a lot of people out there that may not have the best intentions, that tend to be great salespeople, that tend to be great inside of a room. How do we even the playing field? How do we find really good people and give them the tools that they need to become backable? All of this got me studying this idea of backable people. Like, who are these people who are able to get inside a room and they're able to persuade us to take a chance on them? And the trick of it is oftentimes when they have an idea, it's most often something that's new. It's something that's unproven. And yet they still are able to get us to take a chance on it. And I believe that that is one of the defining qualities of somebody who is not just an entrepreneur, but somebody who is entrepreneurial. Anyone who wants to try to create change. Because anything that we're trying to do, at least in the beginning, is not going to be obvious. It's very rare that you can walk into a room, show a full set of data and say, this is absolutely the reason that we need to go do this. Usually it's a guess. Usually it's a hunch. And you have a feeling that something's going to work, but you want other people to have that feeling as well. So who are these people that have this almost mysterious it quality of giving us that feeling? And what I've done over the past 5 years is I have spent time with people who I think are extraordinary at this, from Oscar-winning filmmakers to military leaders, to celebrity chefs, to leaders of iconic companies. And I began to unpack their process. And what I started to realize is that people who tend to be backable today, they tend to have this sort of mysterious it quality. If you rewind the clock and you go back to the early stages of their career, you find something very, very different. They were not born backable. They made themselves backable. And specifically, there were a series of adjustments that they took to make themselves into the backable people that they are today. In the book, what I decided to do is lay out what 7 of those qualities are. 7 things that anyone can do to make themselves backable. And I thought what I would do just with our, a little bit of our time is I would share at a very high level, I'd share 3 of those things with you. And then what we can do is, Kathleen, we can sort of open it up for a discussion. And I can't wait to sort of have a discussion with you. So the first thing that, the first quality that I find myself talking about more and more, especially now, pulling out of the pandemic and in the stage of rebuilding that I think all of us are finding ourselves in, is this idea of flipping outsiders to insiders. Flip outsiders to insiders. So what does that mean? Well, there's a story in the book that I love, and it's about Betty Crocker. And Betty Crocker in the 1940s introduced instant cake mix to the market. And they believed that instant cake mix was going to be the next just hit product. It was going to be a huge sensation because baked goods were a big deal in the 1940s. Everybody seemed to be making them. And in this case, all you needed to do was pour water into a mix and pop it in the oven, and voila, you get this really tasty treat. So who wouldn't want this instant cake mix? So the executives at Betty Crocker are stunned when they find out that no one is really buying this instant cake mix. And they cannot figure out why. So they hired a psychologist named Ernest Dykta to go out into the field and start interviewing homemakers, interviewing customers to figure out like, what's going on here? Why aren't you buying this instant cake mix? And what Dykta comes back with is, I think you have made the process of making a cake too easy, too simple, because you have basically removed the customer from the creative process. All they need to do is pour water into a mix. And so when the cake comes out of the oven, they actually don't feel like it was really their cake. They don't really feel a sense of ownership over it. So Gupta has a recommendation. He says, why don't you remove one ingredient, just one ingredient, and see what happens? And so they do. Betty Crocker decides to remove the egg. So now, as a customer, you have to go to the market, you have to buy eggs, you have to come back, you have to crack them in, you have to mix it in to the mix, and then you pop it in the oven, and sales completely take off. Because now customers feel like they were part of the creative process. When the cake comes out of the oven, they actually feel like it was their cake. And researchers have unpacked this idea and proven this idea out over and over again. A few years ago, there was a group out of Harvard that called this the IKEA effect. And the IKEA effect basically tells us that we place up to 5 times the amount of value on something that we help build than something we simply buy off the shelf. And so there are a lot of people out there with poorly made futons and furniture that they're just never going to get rid of because they feel an emotional attachment to it. They made it themselves. So what does this have anything to do with leadership or creativity or innovation? Well, we've kind of been told that all of this is a 2-step formula, right? You come up with a great idea and you execute on it really well. We debate a lot about, is it the idea, is it the execution? But we fail to see sometimes that there's this important hidden step in between, this hidden step in between idea and execution. And that hidden step is what I call flipping outsiders to insiders. It's where we bring in the early people. We bring in early customers. We bring in early partners. We bring in early employees, and we let them be part of the idea as well. We allow them to take an egg and crack it into the mix. So by the time it reaches execution phase, we reach there together. And I believe that you can trace literally every community initiative, every company initiative, every brand new product, every brand new company, every political movement back to this hidden step. It was never just one person who came up with an idea. It was always a group of people that felt like even though they didn't come up with the idea, they felt ownership over the idea. They felt like it was their idea as well. And so flipping outsiders into insiders by treating people, early people, not like they are buyers, but treating them like they are builders. That's what that concept is all about. And in the book, we go into the detail of how do we actually do that? What are the steps that we need to take in order to make people feel like insiders in our own idea? That's concept number 1. Concept number 2 that I'd like to share with you today is convince yourself first. Convince yourself first. So what do we mean by that? Well, one of the things that I thought I was going to find when I started researching this book is I thought that backable people who tend to be really good inside a room, I thought that they were all going to have a certain style of communication. Right? They were all going to speak with polished sort of hand gestures and eye contact and a good sense of pacing. You know, they were going to be very Toastmasters-esque or very Dale Carnegie-esque. But I did not actually find that to be the case. In fact, I would say that the majority of the backable people that I studied did not have the classic communication styles. In fact, many of them tended to be much more introverted, much more shy. And if you want an example of that, just a quick example of that, go look up the number 1 most popular TED Talk of all time. And what you might be surprised to find is a very un-TED-like presentation. It's a guy named Sir Ken Robinson who gives this beautiful talk on education, but he's got sort of one hand in his pocket. He meanders on and off script. He sort of rambles a little bit, but it's very entertaining and it's also very un-TED-like. What I've realized by studying hundreds of backable people is that it's not charisma that makes a person convincing. It's conviction. Backable people take the time to convince themselves first, and then they let that conviction shine through in whatever style it is that feels most natural to them. So, this might sound familiar to you. I think it sounds familiar to a lot of us, but you're in a moment, you're surrounded by friends, you're surrounded by colleagues, maybe you're on screen like this, or maybe you're inside a room and an idea hits you, inspiration hits you. And you're so excited about this and you decide to share it immediately on the spot. And then you look around the room and you realize that no one is quite as excited about this idea as you are. Right? And this happens to, I think, all of us. Everybody can identify with this. I know I certainly can. What I've realized is that backable people tend to almost do this, they catch themselves in that moment, and they tend to do almost this little sort of analysis, this mini analysis. And the analysis is really simple. It's, do I have conviction over this idea? Before I share this, they ask themselves, do I have conviction for this idea? One way to think about this is my idea a chocolate M&M or is it a peanut M&M? A chocolate M&M, if someone squeezes it, it's going to crack immediately. A peanut M&M is not a piece of steel. It's not a piece of metal, but you can squeeze it and it's not going to crack immediately, right? And the question is this a chocolate M&M idea or is this a peanut M&M idea? If it's a peanut M&M idea, then by all means, share it. There's no time like the present. But if it's a chocolate M&M idea, if it's something that's brand new to you, you haven't had time to really think about it yet. What backable people tend to do is they tend to resist the temptation to share that idea in the moment because they know how fragile a new idea is. Emotionally, we are so susceptible to the way that people react to our ideas, especially when it's brand new, that if we don't get the reaction we're looking for, what we tend to do is we put it in a drawer and we walk away from it. One of the things that I found in my research is that if you look inside organizations and you try to figure out why did great ideas get killed? Like, why didn't they make it to the top? You know, the banking industry thought of Venmo before Venmo. The hospitality industry thought of Airbnb before Airbnb. Blockbuster thought of Netflix before Netflix. Why didn't these ideas make it to the top? What we tended to find is that most great ideas didn't actually get killed inside formal pitch meetings. They actually did not get killed inside formal conference rooms. They got killed inside the hallways. They got killed around water coolers. They got killed inside parking lots through very casual conversations, right? They got killed before they ever had a chance to really live. And so what backable people tend to do is they tend to say, this is a chocolate M&M idea. I'm going to resist the temptation to share it in the moment. And I'm going to take what we call in the book incubation time. Incubation time, to put a peanut inside my idea. I'm going to take some time to convince myself first before I go out and I try to convince other people. Now, the act of building conviction, we talk about a lot in the book. You know, people tend to sort of have different styles for how they build conviction. What do you do during that incubation time? Some people like to draw their ideas out. Some people like to just take long walks and think about their idea. I'm a writer, so I like to just write my ideas out. But I think there's a few principles to keep in mind when you're taking incubation time. One of the things that I'll say to you before I move on to number 3 is that when you're taking incubation time, you want to provide some sort of an end date, some sort of a time limit to this incubation time. Because I also have met people who have been incubating their ideas for years and they're never going to get it out there. And you don't want to be one of those people either. You need to share your idea with the rest of the world. Then one of the ways that I like to do that is by setting some kind of end date, by calling a friend and saying to this friend, hey, 3 weeks from now, I'd like to share an idea with you. Can we put some time on the calendar? And typically the friend will say, well, sure. Yeah. What's this all about? Give me a preview. And I'll say, nope, I can't share that with you right now. But 3 weeks from now, I'd like to share this idea with you. And what that does is it gives me some sort of time frame. I don't have all the time in the world for this incubation time. I don't have all the time in the world to build this conviction, but I have enough. And by the way, the person I'm talking to 3 weeks from now isn't the main decision maker. It's a friend. So I have just enough pressure, but I don't feel like I have to get everything lined up between now and then. I have some sense of forward momentum. And that can be really key when you're convincing yourself first. So just a little recap. We talked about flip outsiders to insiders. We talked about convincing yourself first. The third thing is to do what I call playing exhibition matches. Play exhibition matches. What are these? Well, exhibition matches are low stakes practice sessions before you get into a high stakes moment. What I found is that the backable people tend to almost have this improvisational quality to them. when they speak, they almost, in a lot of cases, they almost seem like they're kind of coming off the cuff, like they're kind of inventing things as they go along. And it can be a really sort of compelling personality trait because you really feel like they're not giving you something that's rehearsed, right? You really feel like you're having a discussion with them in the moment. And it can be energizing. It can be magnetic. But what I found after digging in and studying backable people is that I found that improvisational style actually tends to be the product of lots and lots and lots of practice. In fact, what I found is that most backable people tend to rehearse and practice an average of 21 times before they get into a high stakes moment. So with a new presentation, a new type of pitch, a new type of interview or a type of job that they're trying to go after, they will rehearse 21 times with friendly people through these low stakes sessions before they get into the high stakes moment. Now, if you're anything like me, 21 times might actually sound like overkill to you, right? Like, doesn't that seem like way too much? And the thing that I feared when I first heard 21 times was like, isn't that going to make you sound robotic? Isn't that going to make you sound scripted if you rehearse something 21 times? Like, where's the naturalness? But what I found is that by practicing something 21 times, it actually makes you sound more natural, not less natural. Why? Well, when you have a certain level of mastery over your material, when you know something so well, what it allows you to do is drop the script that's in your head. You're no longer wondering, like you're no longer thinking about, hey, I'm going to say this and then I'm going to say that. You're no longer paying attention to that anymore. That has been committed to such memory and mastery that what you're allowed to do is be fully tuned in to what's happening inside the room. Like right now, I can see only Kathleen's face, but because I have such a mastery of my material, I know the moments that are connecting with her. I can see that. And we've had conversations before, so I've gotten to study her gestures a little bit. I know her smiles, and I'm starting to tune into that. And I also know I can pick up these little cues as to when Kathleen's maybe a little bit confused of what I'm saying, right? And that's happened a couple times already. Yeah, there's the look. That's exactly the look, and I can tune into that. Now, if you study the way that most people go through their presentations and pitches, they're not paying attention to that. They've got a script that they need to get through, a set of slides that they need to get through, and they're going to get through those slides no matter what the feedback is inside the room. Now, if somebody interrupts, then of course, that'll change things. But most of the times people actually don't interrupt. Most of the times people they might have a little bit of a quizzical look on their face, but they're not going to say, wait, I don't understand that. Oftentimes when you're pitching a client or a customer, they're not going to interrupt you. Inside, they don't know what you're talking about, but they're not actually going to interrupt you. It's up to you to sort of be able to read those nonverbal cues. And you can only be able to do that when you're fully present with what's happening inside the room. And you can only get there if you have a real mastery of your material. Charlie Parker, the great jazz musician, was just known to have this just incredible stage presence, like just incredible. And it's what made, he was obviously very gifted as a musician, but he also just knew how to light up a stage. And when he was leaving stage one time, one of his fans, this aspiring musician, ran up to him and said, "Hey, Charlie, like, how do you do it? How do you have such incredible stage presence?" And Charlie Parker thinks about it for a moment and he says, "Well, you got to learn your instrument, and then you practice, practice, practice. And then when you get up on stage, you forget all of that and you just wail. You just wail." It is the practice. It is the practicing things over and over and over and over again that gets us to the point where when we get in that room, when we get in that big moment, that meeting, we can forget all of that and we can just wail. So with that, Kathleen, I'll turn it back over to you and we can open this up.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Okay, first question that's come in is, what's the best and worst investment you ever made?
Well, yeah, I'll start with the worst because it was my own thing. And and when you're investing, as every entrepreneur who's here knows, whenever you're putting your time into something and you're pursuing something, that's the most important investment you can make is your own time. And I invested money into it as well, but it was mainly time. I spent a couple of years working on a project, and the project was that I was trying to tell the story of the first major wave of immigrants that immigrated to the United States. And the way that I was trying to do that was through basically taking a YouTube approach. And what I mean by that is, like, so many people, what I was trying to encourage people to do is sit down with your parents, interview them, get it on video, and then upload it to a central place. I called it the Kahani movement, and Kahani means story in Hindi, in the language that my parents speak. And I made a fundamental flaw, which was that I tried to sort of create this website where all the content would be hosted on that website. Whereas at that time, there was this, YouTube was hitting its stride, Facebook was hitting its stride. And rather than going to where people were already hanging out, I tried to get people to come to where I wanted them to come to my website. And had I gone back and done it again, I would have definitely created Kahani, this project, inside Facebook or inside YouTube, and had that be the destination. So that was definitely the worst. The best, I would say, is probably I would by accident more than anything else. But about 7 years ago, I picked up a habit with meditation, and I needed to do this because I was a new father, and I was also starting a company, and things were very stressful at home. My wife and I were our bank account was not in good shape. We still had student loans, and we just felt like we were running out of money, and it was creating an enormous sort of toll, I think, on me, and I think on my marriage. And so my brother is a health correspondent. He does a lot of he works for CNN, and he goes around the world, and he watches how people take care of their health in different parts of the world. And he had been to a monastery where he had seen people meditate, and he had studied the Dalai Lama. And he came back from that trip, and he said, meditation might be something that you think about. And so I did, and that was 7 years ago, and I have not missed a day of meditation since then. It became very important to me. A few years ago, an entrepreneur came up to me and said, "Hey, I've got an idea for a meditation app. I would like to take this practice of meditation and make it something that's accessible to everybody." And I remember thinking to myself, well, I like to meditate, but I don't know if that would be a really good business idea. I'm not sure. But I decided to invest in it because I felt so strongly about what it had done for me personally, even though I didn't know that it would actually, didn't believe, I didn't have high conviction about whether it would actually be a good business. But to my surprise, this business called Calm, it's called Calm is the app, ended up just completely taking off. When I invested in it, it was I think the valuation of the company was a couple $1,000,000. Today, it is a multi-billion-dollar company, and it's only been a few years. It's literally tens of millions of people use it every week. They meditate using this app, and most of them are people who had never meditated before. It was their way into experiencing meditation. So the worst came from me. The best I actually thought was not going to work, and it actually did work. So that's a little bit of a signal of who I am as an investor.
Sounds something I want.
Yeah, yeah, it's great.
Not a premeditated meditation app.
That's right.
Terrific. Okay. One of the things that you've talked about with us so far today is this play exhibition matches.
Yeah.
And there's an axiom that says facts tell, stories sell.
Mm.
What's the right blend?
Yeah.
As you're thinking about these exhibition matches and how you prepare to present an idea?
Yeah. Yeah. Stories are so important, but they have to be married with substance. Storytelling has become, I think, in vogue in sort of the business world, right? There are sort of books out there, and there are some great talks out there about how storytelling and business come together. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that it's both story and substance. It's not about just getting up in front of a room and saying once upon a time and sort of dropping the mic and leaving, right? After you tell the story. Again, I think both are very, very important. This all sort of, I think, triggered for me. I learned this lesson from Tim Ferriss, who is an author. He's written a book called The 4-Hour Workweek, which became an international sort of best-selling book. And he's written a few books since then. He's got a great podcast. And I was pitching Tim on my business, on my idea, the idea that Kathleen, you talked about in your introduction. It's called Rise. And what we did is we matched you one-on-one with a nutritionist right over your mobile phone. The idea was having a nutritionist in your life can be very effective, but it can also be very expensive. And when I pitched him, what I focused on was mainly the market size that we could go after. The rising rates of hypertension, the rising rates of obesity, the rising rates of diabetes, and how big this market was going to be and how many people could actually use a product like this. And then at the very, very end of my pitch, I told a story. And the story was of my father. And the story was that when my father was in his 40s, he had an emergency quadruple bypass surgery, rushed to the hospital, rushed to the operating room. And I remember I was about 9 years old at the time. And I remember going to the hospital. This is a University of Michigan hospital. And I remember visiting him inside the room and feeling like he had aged 20 years overnight. He looked like a completely different person. And I also remember on the drive home back to our home in Novi, Michigan, I remember I was sitting in the back seat of the car and I was flipping through the paperwork that they give you when you leave the hospital, discharge paperwork. And I noticed a piece of paper, a single sheet of paper, which was how to eat at home. What does a diet look like? And I remember it said things like eat broccoli, eat Brussels sprouts. And I thought to myself, that's a very different diet than we eat at home today. Because what we ate at home was Indian food. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know if this is really going to work for my dad. And the reality is that he really, really struggled with that. Like we couldn't make our lifestyle that different in a way that was really going to stick. And ultimately, that is the challenge with anybody who's on a diet. It's not about, can you do something for a week? It's can you actually make it stick? Can you create long-term behavior change? And in our case, it just didn't work. It didn't work for my dad. And lucky for us, insurance kicked in and helped pay for the cost of a nutritionist to help coach our family into a lifestyle that was really going to work for us, something that fit our tastes, fit our preferences, but at the same time was healthy. And I believe that person is one of the reasons that my father is still alive today. Mm. Now, I told that story to Tim Ferriss, and his feedback to me was, why did you save that story? Why did you make that story a footnote of your presentation? Why did you save it to the very end? You should bring it up to the very beginning of your presentation. You should talk about that story first. And then you can zoom out and you can talk about the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people out there that are going through their own version of your father's story. It's stories that pull us in, and it's substance that keeps us there. And when I made that one adjustment, when I flipped the order of that, when I told the story first, that what I call in the book, the story of my central character, and then talked about the numbers, the way that investors responded to my pitch was very, very different.
Yeah, I love that. Food is medicine has become such a concept, and one in which I believe strongly. Okay, here's another question for you. How do you feel about the current economic environment for people who are looking for funding or backing? Is this the greatest moment of opportunity you've ever seen?
I think it is for two reasons. I think number one, I think there is a lot of capital out there. Now, whether that's going to slow down, whether it's going to sustain, I don't quite know. But when we look at the funding cycles, when we look at sort of the numbers of entrepreneurs that are being invested in, we're not seeing that slow down at all. In fact, counterintuitively, we saw that speed up during the pandemic. But the other reason that I think it's exciting is because we are, I think, for those of us who have been fortunate enough, yeah, there are many of us who have become, I think, during the pandemic, got busier and our lives got even more squeezed than ever before. Um, but there have been quite a few of us who I think have also gotten a little bit more space in our lives. We no longer had the commute anymore that we had. There was a little bit more time added to our day. And I think what has happened is that many people are starting to realize, or with that maybe just a little bit of that additional space, is starting to realize that maybe the way that we have approached things in the past, the way we have lived in the past, may not be necessarily the way that we want to live in the future. And when you're in a routine, when you don't have that space, it can be very easy, as we all know, for the months and the years to fly by without ever realizing that. And sometimes you need a little bit of a breaking point to kind of realize that, hey, I have a self-awareness now that I want to be doing things a little bit differently. And I think the way that a lot of people are deciding to do that is through their own new ventures. And by the way, those new ventures don't necessarily need to be you came up with the next technology company. They could be ventures inside the community. They could be ventures inside your existing organization. But the point is that the common denominator is change. And I think that there's literally never been a better time to create change. Because when you're stuck, when companies and organizations are stuck in the way that they have always done things, it's very hard to change minds. It's very hard to create any type of sort of differential thinking from the way that we've done it before. But because we've come to such a point where things have been disrupted, a lot of the world now is becoming a blank canvas. And that gives us all, I think, room to paint.
Hmm. I think that's terrific, because one of the questions that has come forward is, for those who want to be change makers, how do the principles of backable apply? We all may not be the next entrepreneur,
Yeah.
but we're trying to convince people that we need to move on and make changes, whether they're small ones or big ones. So, what piece of advice would you offer for
Yeah.
change makers?
Well, first of all, I love that whoever asked that question, I love that term, change makers, because that's effective. I think we're all doing that. We're all doing that. It can be in our careers, it can be in our community, it can be with our companies, and it doesn't have to be a big change. It can be a small one. And we know small differences can pile up over time and make huge impact. And so we're all trying to do that. And one of the concepts in the book that I think has been really important for me personally is this idea of finding an earned secret. As a change maker, finding an earned secret. So I'll tell you how this all came to be. I was sitting in the waiting room of a Hollywood producer named Brian Grazer. And Brian Grazer he's won like over 130 Emmys. He's won dozens of Oscars. Have you ever seen the movie Apollo 13 or 8 Mile? If you've seen Arrested Development, the TV show, these are all Brian Grazer productions. And I was sitting in his waiting room, and I noticed that all the people inside the room who were waiting to see Brian were all very nervous. Like, anxiety in the room was very high. So when I went back to see him, I said to Brian, I said, "Hey, you got a room full of nervous people out there. If I could have had the opportunity to coach them before they came here today, and I could give them one piece of advice, what would that piece of advice have been?" And he thinks about it for a moment and he says, "Give me something that I can't easily find on Google. Give me something that is not easily Googleable." Such a strange sort of insight. So I pushed him further. And what I realized as I started to talk more to Brian, as I started to talk more to decision makers, really just people who are behind these changes, right? People who we need to buy into the changes we're trying to create. What I realized is that great meetings, great interviews, great pitches and presentations, they tend to be based on an insight. They tend to be based on something that you have gone out into the world and you have found that may not be very easy to Google. It may not be just it may not be obvious to other people. So let me give you an example that has nothing to do with entrepreneurship. A few weeks ago, somebody came to me, and she's a mother of three, and she's returning to the workforce. And she found a role. She's looking for jobs, and she found a role at a social media company. It was posted online, and she looked at the description of this role, and she said, "My gosh, I would love to have this role. It fits me like a glove." But the trick of it is that she didn't actually use the product. This was not a social media product that she used. It was very much a Gen Z sort of thing. And so she did something very, very clever. She interviewed every single one of her daughter's friends, every single one of them. She got on Zoom just like this and said, "Hey, like, tell me more about the product. Tell me what you like about it. What do you love about it? What do you feel like was different about it? What do you wish was different about it?" And then she did something even more clever. She had them send her screenshots of these moments in their experience. So then she goes to this interview, it's during the pandemic. So, and it's over Zoom, just like this. And now she shows up to this interview, and she doesn't just have her bio. She doesn't just have her resume, but she has on her phone this gallery of screenshots that she has collected. Right. And she's showing this hiring manager all this research that she's done, and she's adding a little bit of her own thoughts based on what she's learning. This hiring manager is so impressed that not only does she get the job, but right in the middle of the interview, he patches in one of their UX designers into the interview so that this UX designer can start to learn a couple of the insights that she's collected on her phone. She had never used the product. And I asked her, "How much time did all of this take you? To all of this cumulatively, all the interviews you did, plus getting all the stuff on your phone?" 2 hours. 2 hours to collect all of this. She did 2 hours of extra work and went from somebody who probably wouldn't have gotten that job to somebody who blew them away. So how do we go out into the world and go beyond Google? How do we do the things that are not as obvious? Go one step further to collect these insights. Because if we want to be change makers, then when we walk into the room, we don't want to just walk in with our ideas. We don't want to just walk in with a resume. We want to walk in with an insight, something that we were able to sort of go out into the world and find that may not be totally obvious.
That's great. What a great story. Stories sell. Okay, here's another question for you. At what point do you know when to give up on an idea and try something else?
Yeah. It's funny, I'm doing this book tour where, I've felt like I've done, many of these now. I've certainly played my 21 exhibition matches, and I never have a good answer to this one because it's something that I struggle with as well. Like, when do you walk away, right? When do you walk away from anything? And one of the things that I will say is that I have found way too many people who walk away after getting one no. Like, and most of the time, it'll be because that one no came from somebody that they respect, right? They admire the way that person thinks, or maybe it's a boss or a senior colleague, and that the logic goes, well, if that person doesn't think it's a good idea, then it's probably not a good idea. And the thing that I would say to you is that if you look at, I mean, I spent a bunch of years in Silicon Valley. I spent some time inside a firm called Kleiner Perkins, which invested in Amazon, invested in Google, invested in Uber, but it also passed on Facebook. It passed on Airbnb. It passed on many, many great investments that they just didn't think were going to work. And ultimately, obviously, they were wrong. When I was working inside the firm, one of the investors told me, "Look, if I say no to 100% of the ideas that come my way, I will be right 99% of the time." And that tends to be the mindset that people take when it comes to change. Most of the time, our kind of gut level reaction is to say no to anything that is new. Right? And you have to keep that in mind, because it doesn't necessarily mean that what you have is a bad idea, but rather you're just sort of getting human nature thrown at you. Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winning economist, who wrote a fascinating book, one of the better books, I think. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And one of the things that that he talked about in the book is that, the pain of making a bad decision is twice as powerful as the pleasure of making a good decision. The pain of making a bad decision is twice as powerful as the pleasure of making a good decision. That's for every human being. And so, the point I'm trying to make is that one no is not sufficient. You want to go out there and you want to talk to lots of people. How many? That's more art than science. But the thing that I will say to you is that you want to get a diversity of opinions, right? So for example, if you have an idea that's in the construction space and you're looking to build a new building, but you go out and you talk to 6 different finance people who are only coming at it from a financial lens, you may continue to get 6 no's. But maybe what you want to do is you want to broaden that a little bit. You want to talk to somebody who is in the finance space, but also you want to talk to a builder. You want to talk to a designer. You want to talk to a marketer. You want to get these diversity of opinions before you come up with a conclusion that this is not a good idea. So it's not just the number of people, but it's also the breadth of opinions that you're going after.
Mm-hmm. Which brings up the whole notion of this incubation period that you've
Absolutely.
talked about. There are lots of people who never get beyond the incubation. It's like the ready, aim, 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 and then it sort of dies on the vine.
Yes.
So that's a challenge, I think. And there's I come from the world of seeking investors, but as donations, as contributions, fundraising. And
Yeah.
so we always say that the one no is that much closer to the next yes.
I think that's so right. And one of the things that I learned on that point is that a no can be as valuable as a yes. So, one of the things I would do when I was starting my company is I would go out and I tend to be sort of a tenacious person, and that can work well for me. But on the other hand, sometimes I'll get a no and I'll just move on. I'll move on to the next thing. But I won't ever, in the past, I hadn't spent time understanding, well, why is that a no? Right? Like if you watch the way elite athletes, get better, they're constantly watching tape, right? They're constantly watching their performances, constantly watching old games, the ones that they lost and the ones that they won. The ones they lost, why didn't they win? The ones they won, why did they win? Right? And there's constant introspection into why didn't things work that I was not applying. And I still remember when I had gotten rejected by over a dozen investors, I sat down with a friend of mine who I went to law school with, and I was venting, I was complaining, and he asked me like, well, why are they passing on the idea? And I said, well, because they don't like the idea. And he said, but why? Why don't they like the idea? And it occurred to me, I didn't have a good answer to that. I had assumed that like maybe there were certain things they didn't like about it, and I thought I knew what those things were, but I hadn't really asked them. So he convinced me to go back to all of the investors who had said no. And what I did is I sent them all an email. And in the email I said, look, totally respect your decision, not trying to change your mind. But would you be willing to spend just 10 minutes with me on the phone talking to me a little bit more about sort of why you said no? And more than half of them said, sure, I'll spend 10 minutes with you on the phone and walk you through that. And so I did. And what I realized from those quick conversations is what I thought was the reason they said no was actually not the reason they said no. For me, I thought it was because I didn't have enough customers in my program. The reason that most of them told me they said no is because they didn't know whether those customers were going to stick around, right? Because I had a product that was focused on getting people into better health, into better shape. If people hit that goal, if they hit their target weight, are they just going to leave and never come back? That was their concern. And so I only had a very limited amount of runway left in the bank to prove out this idea. Had I gone out and spent my time trying to focus on getting more customers, they still would have been a no. Instead, what I decided to do is focus on retention. How do I retain my customers? And I went and built, a very simple analysis showing that customers were actually sticking around, even past the point of losing weight, because they still like the program. They like the coach that we had lined them up with. And I went back to the same investors and I said, hey, again, not trying to change your mind, but I want you to know that because of your advice, I went out and did this, and I wanted to show you the results. 2 of the investors who had previously said no changed their answer to a yes.
Mm-hmm. Which is another axiom in the fundraising business. If you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Okay, here's our one comment, and then who said, calm, I love it. Use it, love it. Um, how did you convince your 8-year-old daughter to clean up her room?
Well, part of it is flipping outsiders to insiders, right? And I realize, the importance of, I think, making people belong to a plan, right, rather than trying to tell them to do something. When I spoke to somebody the other day about this concept of flipping outsiders to insiders, he said he's a CEO of a company, right? I mean, he has a team, and he can obviously sort of come in and pound the table and say, this is what we're doing, let's go do that. But he said, the one thing I've learned after 30 years of being a CEO is that it's much, much better to plant seeds and not bullets. Seeds, not bullets, right? And I think very much it's the same way with Sammy, my daughter, which is, she has a younger sister, and one of the things we always talk about is, hey, your younger sister's always looking at the way your room is, and the way your room is going to be the way that her room is. And so it's almost, instead of telling her to clean her room, it's how do we get your sister to clean her room? What do we need to do? And so we're kind of teaming up. And what we've realized, and I think what my older daughters realized, is the best way to get her younger sister to keep her room clean is if she keeps her room clean. And she's part of the program. She hasn't bought a piece of furniture. We sort of built that piece of furniture together.
Ah, very good. Very good. Well, again, the book is terrific. Thank you, because I have obviously been identifying those things that I plan to carry into practice, number one. So thank you so much. You have some parting comments for us?
Sure. Yeah. As you can tell, Kathleen, I'm a storyteller. I do love telling stories, and I think the root story in this book is really the story of a woman named Damayanti Hingorani. And Damayanti Hingorani, what makes her story spectacular is that she grew up on the border of Pakistan and India in a refugee camp. No running water, no electricity, but she did something remarkable. She taught herself how to read. And the first book that she read from cover to cover was the biography of Henry Ford. And after reading this biography, she decided that one day she wanted to be an engineer with Ford Motor Company, which was a very unlikely sort of vision or dream for a little girl in a refugee camp to have. This was also the 1950s, and it very unlikely for that to happen. But her parents got behind the dream. They saved every penny they had. She was able to get on a ship to the United States. She got a scholarship to Oklahoma State University. The day after she graduates, she goes to Detroit, Michigan, where she applies for her dream job, and she's able to find her way into a room with a hiring manager. Now, this hiring manager looks at her resume and he looks at her application and he says, wait a second, are you applying for the job of an engineer? And she says, yeah. He says, well, I'm sorry, we don't have any female engineers right now, degreed engineers on staff. And you can see this is the 1960s at this point, and Ford Motor Company was in its heyday, but all the engineers on staff were men. And so Damayanti Hingorani is really deflated in this moment, and she picks up her resume and she picks up her purse and she begins to walk out of the room. And then in this almost just last ditch moment, she turns around and she summons all of the courage, all of the grit, all of the determination she can find. And she looks this guy in the eyes and she tells him her story of all the struggle that it took for her to get to this country, to get to Detroit, to get to this very room. And then she says to him, look, things are changing. And if you don't have any female engineers, then do yourself a favor and hire me now. And this hiring manager is so inspired by this meeting that he goes out and he advocates and he fights for Damayanti Hingorani with all of his colleagues, with his superiors. He fights and he advocates for her. And in 1967, she becomes Ford Motor Company's first degreed female engineer. And I love that story because it ended up inspiring a lot of people, immigrants that were hoping for a better day, women in the workforce and in the engineering field. And it also inspired me because Damayanti Hingorani is my mom. And if a hiring manager, if a middle manager from suburban Michigan hadn't taken a chance on a refugee from the other side of the world, then I wouldn't be here sharing her story with you right now. And so if I could leave you with one thing, it's that as we go out into the world, especially as we start to rebuild now after the pandemic, let's not just look for ways to make ourselves backable, but let's find good people and let's help them become backable. Because sometimes the best way for us to change the world is to take a chance on someone else. So thank you so much.
Thank you. What great inspirational words from you. And I think any one of the concepts that you have shared with us today, more packed into the book, could all make us be more backable than we may have ever considered, whether it's a small change or a big idea, equally effective and helpful. So thanks again. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So just a reminder to our members, thank you for being here today and farewell until July 22nd, our first in-person meeting in more than a year, when our speaker will be Paul Britton of Britton Banners. So mark your calendars for July 22nd right now, and we'll see you soon. Thank you again. Perfect.